Sarah Miller was only 24 years old when the night that would define her life unfolded. Born and raised in Greenwood, Mississippi, she lived in a town where the color of your skin decided the limits of your life before you ever took your first breath. For black families like hers, survival meant silence, hard work, and constant prayer. Sarah's mother, Delilah Miller, had raised her children alone after her husband passed from pneumonia when Sarah was just 12. Delilah was a woman of resilience, working as a cook for a wealthy white family, while Sarah and her brothers learned early what it meant to carry dignity in a world that denied it to them. By her early 20s, Sarah was known in her neighborhood for two things: her gifted sewing and her sharp tongue. She was not the type of woman who bowed her head unnecessarily. She worked long hours as a seamstress, patching up uniforms, dresses, and Sunday suits for both black and white townsfolk. But her true pride was her daughter, little Anna, just 6 years old. Sarah would often tell Anna, "One day you'll see a world where you don't have to bow your head to no one." The little girl believed every word, but Greenwood was the kind of town where truth could be a dangerous thing. Sheriff Roy Haskins made sure of that. Haskins was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a permanent sneer etched on his face. He wore his badge like a crown and carried his revolver as if it were a scepter. For years, black families whispered about his brutality, how he beat men who didn't move fast enough, how he humiliated women, how he abused his power in every dark corner of the county. But no one spoke up. They knew the cost. It was a humid night in August when Sarah left the small shop where she had been mending clothes. She tucked her sewing kit under her arm, adjusted her simple cotton dress, and began the mile-long walk back home. The cicadas hummed in the darkness, and the gravel crunched under her worn shoes. Then came the sound that made her stomach twist, the slow roll of tires on gravel behind her. She turned and saw the sheriff's patrol car, its headlights cutting through the night like knives. The car stopped. Haskins stepped out, his shadow long and heavy in the glow of the lights. "Evening, girl," he said with a drawl that dripped with menace. Sarah's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand tall. "What do you want, Sheriff?" she asked. He smirked. "You know what I want." What followed was swift and violent. He grabbed her arm, and when she tried to pull away, he struck her across the face. She screamed, but there was no one to hear on that lonely stretch of road. The sheriff's violence was fueled not just by hatred, but by the belief that no one would ever hold him accountable. After all, who would believe the word of a young black woman against a white lawman in Mississippi? When Sarah clawed at his face, leaving a thin scratch, his rage boiled over. He shoved her to the ground, fired his gun into the air, and shouted, "She attacked me!" before leaving her crumpled on the roadside. Neighbors later said they heard the shot echo across the fields. When two of them, Mr. Daniels, an old farmer, and his wife Clara, came running, they found Sarah barely conscious, her face bloodied, her dress torn. Clara knelt beside her, whispering, "Lord, keep this child safe." They carried her to their small wooden home, where Sarah awoke hours later, her body aching but her mind sharper than ever. Most women would have chosen silence. In Greenwood, silence was safety. But Sarah looked at little Anna sleeping in Clara's arms and thought, "If I stay silent, he'll do this to someone else's daughter." That decision would change everything. The next morning, bruised but unbowed, Sarah walked into the courthouse. The white clerk behind the desk laughed when she said she wanted to file charges against the sheriff. "Girl, you best go home before you make life harder for yourself," he said. But Sarah refused. Her persistence reached Reverend James Carter, a local preacher who had quietly been working with the NAACP to document racial violence. Reverend Carter had lost hope years before after watching too many cases buried by lies. But Sarah's fire reignited his own. Together, they contacted Lydia Freeman, one of the few black female lawyers practicing in the South. Lydia was fearless. When she met Sarah in the back of a small church, she took her hand and said, "If you're brave enough to tell your truth, I'll stand beside you every step of the way." The trial date was set, and Greenwood buzzed with whispers. White townsfolk scoffed at the idea, while black families quietly prayed for Sarah's safety. The courthouse was packed the day the trial began. Sarah wore a simple blue dress, her bruises still faintly visible. She walked past rows of sneering white faces, past the sheriff who smirked as if victory was already his. The prosecutor tore into her character, suggesting she was reckless, immoral, and a troublemaker. He accused her of lying, of trying to ruin a good man's name. Every word was meant to break her. But when Sarah took the witness stand, she straightened her back, looked the jury in the eyes, and said, "I am not here because I want revenge. I am here because I have a daughter, and I want her to grow up in a world where men like him don't decide who gets to live with dignity." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled notes furiously. The sheriff's lawyer objected, but the words were already out, powerful, undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. When they returned, the verdict was no surprise. Not guilty. The sheriff walked free, arrogance still painted on his face. Sarah, however, walked out of that courthouse a different woman. Though the law had failed her, she had spoken her truth before the world, and the world had listened. News of the trial spread beyond Greenwood. Black newspapers across the South printed Sarah's story. Northern journalists picked it up, drawing attention to the brutality faced by black women in the Jim Crow South. Letters flooded in, some hateful but many supportive. Women wrote to Sarah saying, "Your courage gave me strength to tell my story." She became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resistance. Reverend Carter encouraged her to travel with him, speaking at churches and rallies. At first, Sarah hesitated. She was just a seamstress, not a leader. But when she saw crowds of women weeping as she told her story, she realized her pain had become something greater, a movement. Over the years, Sarah testified before community groups, civil rights gatherings, and even national conferences. She told audiences that silence was the greatest weapon of oppressors. "If they can keep us quiet, they can keep us powerless," she would say. Her words carried weight because they were born not from theory, but from lived truth. Her daughter Anna grew up traveling with her mother, watching as Sarah turned trauma into power. By the time Anna was in college, Sarah's story had become part of civil rights history. A reminder that the fight wasn't only about buses and voting rights, it was also about women's bodies, dignity, and safety. In her later years, Sarah often sat on her porch with Anna, now grown, and reflected on that night. "I was supposed to stay silent," she would say softly. "But silence would have killed me faster than his hands ever could." Today, Sarah Miller's name is remembered in civil rights archives, her story told alongside others who fought not with fists or weapons, but with unshakable courage. She never saw her attacker face justice in life, but she made sure the world knew his crimes. More importantly, she showed her daughter and generations after that even when the system turns its back, truth spoken boldly can echo louder than any verdict.